me just get my wrench over here. So as I'm talking, I can just get taller, like so. Whoa. What's up, YouTube? Welcome to Fred's Full Throttle. Each week I'm going to take you on my adventures in the world of cars, and then once in a while we're going to do something with a motorcycle. Alright, so for today's video I'm going to talk about the 2012 Ducati Streetfighter 848, and I'm going to be getting it ready for the track. In order to do a track day, you've got to make sure that the bike is in tip-top mechanical condition, but you also have to do a couple things to get it safer for the track. All of those changes are in regards to safety, but it's important to do that so that you pass tech inspection and so that you can actually get out on the track. So here's the quick rundown on the types of things you need to do for the bike. First of all, it has to be in really good shape. There can't be any rust, there can't be any obvious signs of damage to any of the structural components. Bodywork doesn't matter as much, but if you have a dent, like, you know, in the frame, or if you have any kind of signs of rust, like on the chain or the sprockets, that can be a problem, and you won't pass inspection. They make sure that you have a plastic front headlight. If you have a plastic one, you're fine. If you have a glass one, which might be more typical on an older motorcycle, they ask you to put tape over it. And that's so if you get in a crash and the glass actually fractures, that you don't have shards of glass going everywhere. It kind of keeps things contained. Plastic doesn't do that, it doesn't shatter, and the pieces are not dangerous, they're not super sharp. So that's the first thing that they check. So they also have you remove your mirrors. That way they're not sticking out or can shatter in a crash, especially if the mirror itself is glass, if that's the case. They make sure that your throttle snaps back. So when you let off the throttle, that it actually returns right to zero throttle. So the next thing is they want to make sure that your chain is in good shape. That means no rust, it shouldn't be squeaky, and that it should be in good mechanical condition. So the other piece of that is also making sure that the sprocket on the back, actually that the teeth look kind of how they do from the factory. They're not kind of carved out. Over time, a motorcycle, especially something with high power, you'll see that it actually kind of wears deeper and deeper grooves, and it kind of widens those openings and means it doesn't follow the chain as well. So they'll check for that. They also check to make sure that you have the right amount of slack in your chain. Your chain should ideally move between 1 to 2 inches up or down in that slack. A tight chain is actually one that's more likely to break under high acceleration. And so having a little bit of slack just lets the driveline absorb a little bit more of the shock that it's going to encounter as the suspension compresses, as you're getting on the throttle. So that's something important to check. So the next thing that they check for is you need to disconnect your taillights. So what that means is that whether you press the brake pedal or you press the brake lever, you're not going to have any light come through this taillight. Now it doesn't mean that you actually have to disconnect the wires. You can put tape over it, but if any light comes through, you need to fix that. So if you're going to tape it, what you do is you put painter's tape, which will easily remove from the plastic later without leaving residue. But painter's tape's generally not thick enough, so you either need to do a few coats or painter's tape and then duct tape on top of that, and that'll block any of the light. Usually, at least on past bikes, I've just pulled the fuse and disconnected it, and it wasn't a problem. I haven't done that on this bike, and actually I'm kind of doing this for the first time. I've never pulled apart any of this stuff in the back, so we're going to see how easy that is to do. The next thing is they have you, if there are any sharp edges on your license plate, they have you go through and make sure that the license plate is either removed or that you put tape around it. I'm actually going to go and remove the whole assembly, including the blinkers. It's only 4 screws that holds the whole thing on, unplug it, and then it should be fine. So the next thing that they check... Something just moved? Anyway, so the next thing that they check is they make sure that your oil filter has a hose clamp around it and then it's safety wired. And so what that's for is to make sure that the oil filter doesn't unscrew while you're riding on the track. That would be really dangerous. It would get oil on the track, bikes would tip over, people would slide out, there'd be lots of accidents. You want to avoid that. And what that means is you just get a hose clamp similar to this, and it will wrap around the filter, and then you will loop a safety wire through it and then hard connect it to something on the bike, another nut or a screw or something. And what that does is when this is cinched down tight, the oil filter can't back out. And then on top of that, what you do is if the oil filter turns a certain way, you have it actually pulling the opposite way, so it absolutely cannot unscrew. If it's pulling in the same direction it takes to unscrew the filter, it's not going to do any good. Alright, so the first thing is I'm going to try to take this off. So I'm not sure what the best way to do it. I haven't done this before. So I'm going to pop the rear seat off. And there's basically nothing here. So I think I'm going to have to go from the other side. So let's give that a try. All right, so this is a 4mm bolt. I think I see how this goes, and it looks like there's a plate that comes off on the bottom, and then there might be a bigger screw up inside. So that's not coming off. Well, this is a little bit of an adventure. We'll see how easily this comes off. Oh, there we go. Here we go. So I've got this panel here. We're going to set that down. We'll get to that in a minute. There's the bike battery. I didn't know that was in there. So part of the fun of the first time you do this on a bike is figuring out what parts you have to remove. We're going to fast forward for a second and get to the actual interesting part. All right, so it took me a little bit longer. You'll notice the seat is now off and the back is looking a little bit rougher for wear. Turns out that this plate here, there is a hidden screw in this groove. So I'd remove these screws, I'd remove these screws, and I'd remove these screws. And it turns out there's a 7th screw. Once that pops out, then this thing actually comes off pretty easy. Now, I can see that there are 2 hex bolts that I need to get rid of. Maybe they didn't intend you to take this to the track as often. Suffice it to say, this isn't quite as easy as the paper was. So we're gonna figure out which, it's weird. So we're gonna figure out which cables to disconnect here. A lot of extra hardware. So that assembly is plastic, and you can see that this is a metal plate, and then these kind of collars go inside it, and then the screws go up inside that. They were then hidden under, oh, here it is. They were then hidden under that plastic bracket. It's kind of a mess. All right, so the good news is this plug here that I undid is for the taillights, so that's good. The bad news is that I think I'm gonna have to remove this whole tail section to unplug the other end of the cable that's attached to the blinkers. All right, so this yellow plug right here, which goes into here, that is for the taillight. That's all set. But you can see there are wires coming out of the bottom under here. This is what I was talking about. Here's the top of that plastic plate. Right there is the bottom of the plastic plate. There's a bunch of the hardware. You can see the blinkers are actually laying on the ground next to this. Now the problem is, so the blinkers have a quick disconnect, which is pretty handy, but the taillight, or I'm sorry, the license plate light does not. So if you follow the wire back up, let's see if I can get it on the camera. You can see there, it goes up here. That is this wire right here, which is a bundle, which then loops, you can see it here, down into this, which this whole assembly, there's nothing that you can disconnect to pull that out. So instead what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna unthread these 3 cables through this hole. I'll pop the body panel back on, this one right here. There's gonna be an opening here. I'm gonna tuck everything inside, probably wrap some tape around it, and then seal that off. And so the plugs will just basically be empty, but it'll at least function, and I don't have to cut anything. I could certainly cut it, but I want this bike to be easy to get back to street legal, so that's what I'm gonna do. But this is definitely a little bit harder than I thought. I'm glad I'm tackling it a week before the track day instead of like the day before. All right, not perfect, but better than nothing. All right, so the next step is to take these, tape them up in a bundle, kind of cram them up in the back of this thing. First thing I'm doing is these exposed leads for the license plate light. I'll wrap each one of these separately. What a pain that is. Pause number 2 or 3. I'm going to do a little bit of rewiring and then we'll come back. So you can see down here, this is where the cables were coming through. These are the 2 main bolts. Those are the first ones I pulled off. And then these are where those kind of silver nuts were. And the way that it works out is that there was a metal plate that was sandwiched right here that kind of held the whole bracket on, but there was a couple layers. And so with these spacers that came on it, I can pull things flush. But up here, if I put the screws in, they would basically not have anything to press against. I could tighten them all the way in and they just weren't getting any kind of grip. And so the downside here is that this is not quite pulled as flush as it would be normally, but I mean, it's pretty darn close. These are nice, as tight as I could get them so that they're not going to come off. But yeah, so that ordeal is done. And so the last thing I need to do is pop the mirrors off here. So we're going to do that in just a second. Oh, I forgot to mention, so these are those 3 wires that were, so here's the license plate light, and each of these 2 right here, these 2 black plugs, these are the blinker lights. And so I was able to actually fish them back up through rather than clip anything. And I'm just sort of tucking them out of the way. This is the brake light, as I had mentioned before. And so now I need to basically tuck everything back in, put that plate on, and then put the seat back on, and then this part will be done. So I wanted to mention that. So I didn't have to clip anything, which is good. But yeah, just sort of a order of operations. You got to get everything just right. Alright, so I got the seat back together. You can see it looks a lot better. It looks nice and clean without anything here. And the real test is if I press the brake lever, nothing happens. Now, one thing to note is when you disconnect a lot of stuff on the bike, sometimes you're going to get error codes. I know on the Hyper, basically when I disconnected kind of the whole rear assembly, I would get kind of a check engine light that would pop on and say, you know, some sort of electrical fault. It doesn't impact the ability of the bike to drive. It's not physically anything wrong, but I don't know on this bike if that'll do that, so that's something I'm going to have to pay attention for. Alright, so the last thing that I need to do is pop the mirrors off here, which thankfully is pretty easy. Now, one quick thing to notice, if you see how I'm turning the screw here, I'm turning it clockwise, which is the opposite of what a normal screw would be for loosening. And that's just due to the pressure of the wind. They've purposely made it so that the screws spin opposite directions. So the other one's going to spin the correct direction. But just a little thing to note. So single screw, easy to pop off. There's one. This one's going the other way. And now the bike is looking quite a bit more ready for the track. I'm excited. This is going to be fun. All right, so you can see that I've got the mirrors, I've got the screws taped in, and then for this, I reassembled it. So I actually got most of the screws in place. I put the metal bracket that I was talking about in here because the screws that are remaining can't hold it steadily. There's nothing to screw into. And then the last 2 screws and collars are here. So I've got the whole assembly basically reassembled, which is nice. It means I only have three kind of main components that I have to store and pay attention to. Anyway, so that's all there is to it. I say that like that was easy. So that was what it took to get the bike track ready. A little bit more than I thought it would be. But I mean, that is how it goes. I'll probably leave it in track setup for the summer because I'm planning to do a couple different events. I'm going to be putting some cameras on it and getting it all set to go. And I'll be sharing that with you guys as well. Until next time, Fred out!